Hey, black boy, you don't belong here. The officer's voice thundered across the country club. Cameras started rolling as they cuffed the calm, well-dressed man who said nothing until he whispered, "Call the Capitol." That's when every cop's face turned pale because the man they just arrested was a US senator. 3 police officers marched briskly across the pristine pavement, their boots clapping against the concrete like a warning. At the center of it all stood a man in a light beige suit, calm, collected, and unbothered. His silver hair glimmered faintly in the sunlight. He stood with his hands clasped in front of him, his gaze steady as the officers approached. "This is private property," barked the lead officer, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting the man's composed face. "Members only. Let's see some ID before I have to escort you out." The man turned slightly, his voice smooth and deliberate. "Is there a problem, officer?" The officer scoffed, stepping closer. "Yeah, there's a problem. You loitering around this club like you own the place." "I see," the man replied, the faintest trace of a smile touching his lips. "And what makes you think I don't belong?" "You people don't belong here," the officer said under his breath, but loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. A few members gasped, others whispered nervously, unsure if they should step in. The club's manager, a pale, nervous man with a clipboard, watched from a distance but didn't move an inch. It was easier to stay quiet than confront an officer. "Hands where I can see them," the officer ordered, reaching for his holster. "Now!" The man raised his hands slightly, unthreatened. "You're making a mistake," he said calmly. "A big one, yeah?" The officer smirked. "We'll see about that. What's your name?" "David Miles," he answered simply. "All right, Mr. Miles," the officer said mockingly. "You can tell me your full name down at the station. You're under arrest for trespassing." Phones came up. Recording started. Someone muttered, "Is he really getting arrested? For standing there?" Another voice whispered, "I think I've seen that man before." But the officers didn't listen. They moved in quickly, one pulling out cuffs, another keeping his baton ready. The calm man didn't resist. He merely sighed, eyes fixed on the lake shimmering behind them. As they clasped the cold metal around his wrists, one officer leaned in close. "You think you're special or something, huh?" David's voice was steady, unbroken. "Special? No. Accountable? Absolutely." The officer frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" David looked him straight in the eye. "It means that when this is over, you'll remember my name." The crowd grew restless. A woman in a blue dress called out, "That's enough. He didn't do anything." Another man began to film closer, narrating softly, "These officers are arresting a black man for standing outside the Lakeside Country Club." The officers ignored them, pushing David gently but firmly toward the patrol car. As they opened the door, he finally turned his head slightly toward the crowd and said in a low voice, "Don't worry, the truth always finds its way out." For a moment his eyes met those of the club manager, who looked terrified, not for David, but for what was about to come next. Inside the patrol car, David remained silent. He looked out the window as the country club faded into the distance, the green lawns giving way to grey asphalt. One of the officers riding shotgun turned around. "You got some nerve coming up there dressed like that, thinking you can walk around like you belong." David smiled faintly. "Funny," he said. "I was thinking the same about you." The officer scowled. "You better watch your mouth." "I would," David said. "If I were the one in the wrong." The rest of the ride was silent. When they arrived at the station, the chief, an older man with a heavy frame and tired eyes, looked up from his desk. "What's this about?" he asked. "Caught this guy trespassing at Lakeside Country Club," the lead officer said proudly. "Wouldn't leave. Got mouthy, too." The chief raised an eyebrow. "Name?" "David Miles." The chief froze. The pen in his hand stopped mid-air. "Repeat that?" "David Miles," the officer said again. "Why? You know him?" The room grew painfully quiet. The chief stood up slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to dread. He walked over to David, who sat calmly in the chair, cuffed but dignified. "Sir," the chief said carefully, "you're Senator David Miles?" David nodded once. "Last I checked, yes." Color drained from the officer's face. His grip on his baton loosened. "Senator?" he stammered. "From Washington?" David looked up, his calm voice cutting through the silence. "From the United States Senate. And you just arrested me outside a club that I helped fund to stay open during the pandemic." The chief exhaled sharply. "Oh, dear God," he turned to the officers, his voice shaking with restrained anger. "Take those cuffs off him, now!" The officers scrambled, fumbling with the keys, avoiding the senator's gaze. David stood, rubbing his wrists, then looked each of them in the eye. "You judged me," he said quietly, "not by what I did, but by what I look like. That's the real trespass here. As he walked out of the station, silence followed him. Reporters had already gathered outside. The video of his arrest had gone viral in minutes. The words "Black man arrested for trespassing at country club" were plastered across every screen. And though the officers stood behind the glass, watching him leave, they knew one thing for certain. They hadn't just cuffed a man. They had handcuffed their own careers. By the time David Miles reached his car outside the precinct, the world already knew what had happened. Someone's video, shaky, grainy, and full of outrage, had been uploaded to every platform within minutes. The title burned across screens: "Black man arrested for standing outside country club. Turns out he's a US senator." The clip had everything: the officer shouting, "Hey, black boy, you don't belong here!" The crowd gasping, the handcuffs snapping shut. And finally, David's calm, unforgettable words: "That's the real trespass here." Within an hour, the clip had millions of views. Hashtags exploded across social media. "Eat Senator Miles," hashtag "Justice for David," hashtag "You don't belong here." The story was no longer local. It had become national. Back at the Lakeside Country Club, chaos reigned. The manager, Robert Hanley, hadn't slept. Reporters crowded the front gate, microphones flashing, cameras rolling. Members cancelled their reservations. The board held an emergency meeting, trying desperately to salvage their reputation. "I didn't know who he was," Robert kept saying, wiping sweat from his forehead. "He didn't have a membership tag. I didn't recognize him." "That's not the point, Robert," snapped one of the board members. "You called the police on a United States senator because you thought he didn't belong. Do you realize what this looks like?" Robert sank into his chair, speechless. Meanwhile, in Washington, the news hit Capitol Hill like an earthquake. Senators crowded around televisions in the break room, stunned. "That's David?" one murmured. "At Lakeside?" another whispered. "He's always been quiet, never flashy, but look how they treated him." By noon, every major news network had reached out to his office. His assistants were overwhelmed, his phone buzzing non-stop. But David wasn't taking calls. He sat alone in his study, blinds half closed, the muted sunlight brushing across rows of framed photographs. His family, his campaign team, his oath-taking ceremony. He replayed the video silently, watching himself stand still while the officers yelled. Not out of anger, but reflection. The faces of those who recorded, the silence of those who didn't speak up. Each one told a story of its own. He picked up the phone, finally calling his chief aide, Mariah. "Set a press conference," he said quietly. "Today, 3 o'clock. Mariah hesitated. "Sir, are you sure? The network offers are—" "No interviews," he interrupted. Just one message, my words, no filters." By mid-afternoon, the plaza outside the Capitol overflowed with journalists, cameras, and protesters, carrying signs. "Being black isn't trespassing. Justice for Senator Miles. Change starts now." When David stepped up to the podium, the crowd fell silent. He adjusted the microphone, his calm presence commanding attention. "I've spent my life serving this country," he began, his deep voice carrying across the steps. "I've written laws to make communities safer, fairer. But yesterday I wasn't a senator, I wasn't a lawmaker, I was just another black man being told he didn't belong." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "The officers who arrested me didn't ask for my name. They didn't ask for my story. They saw a color before they saw a person." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like a heavy truth. "This isn't about me," he continued. "This is about every person who's been judged, silenced, or profiled because of what they look like. I will not press charges, but I will demand reform. Not just in Lakeside. Everywhere." Applause erupted. People rose to their feet, chanting his name. Cameras flashed, capturing the calm defiance in his eyes. Somewhere, in a small police department 2 states away, the same officers who had cuffed him sat in silence, watching the broadcast. The lead officer, Daniels, rubbed his temples, regret etched across his face. "We're done," he muttered. "It's over for us." His partner glanced nervously at him. "You think he'll press charges?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "No, he's not that kind of man," he swallowed hard. "But the world's going to make sure we answer for it." By evening, the governor had issued an official statement condemning the incident. The police department was under federal review. The mayor of Lakeside called David personally to apologize. But none of that mattered to him as much as what happened next. As he left the Capitol that night, he noticed a group of young students waiting outside. Black, white, Latino, all holding signs that read, "You belong, we belong." One of them, a young girl about 12, handed him a handwritten letter. "My dad says you made him cry," she said softly. "He said, you stood up for all of us." David smiled, kneeling down to meet her eyes. "No," he said gently. "We're all standing up together. The girl hugged him before running off to her family, leaving him with the letter in his hand. He unfolded it as he walked toward his car. It simply read, "Dear Senator Miles, thank you for showing the world that dignity is stronger than hate." He looked up at the night sky, the Capitol lights glowing behind him, and exhaled deeply. The battle was just beginning. But for the first time in a long time he could feel something shifting, something powerful and unstoppable. That night, as the video continued to spread across the globe, the message became bigger than the man himself. The world wasn't just watching a senator anymore. They were watching a movement begin. The Lakeside Police Department hadn't been this quiet in years. Usually, mornings were filled with chatter, radios buzzing, coffee brewing, jokes exchanged between officers before their shifts. But now, every sound carried a weight of fear. Every whisper was about one thing: Senator David Miles. The department's phone hadn't stopped ringing since the video went viral. Reporters camped outside the building. Protesters held up signs across the street chanting, "Equal justice now and accountability for all." Inside, Officer Daniels sat at his desk, staring blankly at his badge. It gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but it didn't feel like honor anymore. It felt like guilt. Across from him, Officer Trent fidgeted nervously. "You think they'll fire us?" he asked. Daniels didn't answer. He just rubbed his temples. "Doesn't matter," he muttered. "We messed up. Big time." Chief Warner stepped out of his office, his face pale and drawn. "Gentlemen," he said, voice stern but tired, "the Department of Justice is reviewing our conduct. Senator Miles refused to press criminal charges, but the investigation's moving forward." Trent swallowed hard. "Refused? Why?" Warner looked at him sharply. "Because he's giving us something worse than punishment." Daniels frowned. "And what's that?" "Reflection," the chief said. "He's coming here. Today." The room went silent. By noon, the atmosphere was suffocating. Officers straightened their uniforms, fixed their caps, and tried to look busy, but the tension was thick enough to cut through. When the dark black sedan pulled up outside, every head turned. The door opened slowly, and out stepped Senator David Miles, calm, composed, wearing the same beige suit he had been arrested in days ago. Cameras flashed from across the street, capturing every second of his arrival. He walked through the station doors without a single word from the reporters. His presence alone seemed to command silence. Chief Warner stepped forward nervously. "Senator Miles," he greeted, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. David shook it briefly. "Chief," his voice was polite but firm, "I appreciate your invitation." He turned his gaze toward the line of officers standing awkwardly in the hallway. Among them were Daniels and Trent, eyes fixed on the floor. David looked around the precinct, at the flag hanging behind the front desk, the framed motto that read, "To serve and protect." He nodded slightly, then spoke. "I came here today," he began, his voice low but resonant, "not to shame anyone, but to remind you of something." He took a step forward, his calm eyes sweeping the room. "When you wear that badge, you don't just represent this town, you represent justice. Every choice you make defines what that word means to someone." Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his throat tightening. David continued, "The day you arrested me, I wasn't angry. I was disappointed. Not because of the cuffs or the words, but because you saw my color before my character." The words hit like a thunderclap. Trent tried to look up, but couldn't meet his gaze. "Sir, we didn't—" "Yes, you did," David interrupted softly. "You assumed. And that assumption is what breaks trust between communities and the people sworn to protect them." Silence stretched. David walked closer to the two men. "Do you know what I thought, standing there in those cuffs?" he asked. Daniel shook his head. "I thought about my father," David said, his voice steady. "A man who wore the same uniform you do. He believed in this badge, believed that it could stand for good. But he also knew that if justice isn't equal, it isn't justice at all." Daniels blinked, stunned. "Your father was a cop," David nodded. 30 years in the force, died in the line of duty." He took a deep breath. "That's why this hurts so deeply. Because I know the good this uniform can represent." No one moved. The only sound was the faint hum of a ceiling fan turning above them. David turned toward the chief. "I don't want these men destroyed," he said firmly. "I want them changed. I'm starting a program in the Senate, training focused on empathy, awareness, and racial accountability in law enforcement. I want your department to be the first to pilot it." The chief blinked, surprised. You trust us with that?" David smiled faintly. "Trust has to start somewhere." He turned to leave, but paused at the door, looking back at Daniels. One more thing, he said. The next time you see a man standing where you think he doesn't belong, ask him his name before you decide who he is. Daniels swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. Senator Miles. I'm sorry, David nodded once. Then prove it. He walked out, cameras flashing again as he stepped into the sunlight. That evening, the clip of his visit spread just as quickly as the original arrest. The internet dubbed it the forgiveness speech. People called it leadership, compassion, strength. Inside the lakeside precinct, Daniels sat alone after everyone left. He removed his sunglasses, stared at his reflection in the locker mirror, and whispered, "Ask his name." For the first time in his career, he understood what those words truly meant. Across town, Senator Miles sat in his office, reading letters from citizens. One read, "You didn't just change the conversation, Senator. You changed hearts." He smiled faintly, closing the envelope. The world was still broken, but for the first time in years he felt something shift, not in policy, not in politics, but in people. And that, he thought, was where real change began. A month had passed since the incident that shook the nation. Lakeside was no longer just a quiet town by the water. It had become a symbol of reckoning, reflection, and reform. Where there were once angry chants and flashing cameras, now stood a banner outside City Hall that read, "Lakeside Police, a new beginning." Inside, the department buzzed with energy, not fear. Officers, young and old, sat in a training seminar watching a video of Senator David Miles speaking about empathy, awareness, and understanding community trust. "Every person you meet carries a story," he said in the video. "Sometimes, all it takes to change a life, or save one, is listening before judging." Daniel sat in the front row, his notepad open, every word sinking deeper than he expected. He hadn't been suspended, but he'd requested to stay on duty under probation, by choice. He wanted to learn, to do better. Next to him, Officer Trent scribbled notes, occasionally glancing at the screen where David Miles's calm face spoke truths they could no longer ignore. When the session ended, Chief Warner addressed the group. "I won't sugarcoat it," he said. "We failed that man. But he gave us something no punishment ever could, a second chance. This program he started, it's not about guilt, it's about growth." The room filled with quiet nods. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Senator Miles stood before a packed Senate chamber, cameras lined the walls, and millions watched live across the country. He wasn't reading from a teleprompter today. His speech came straight from the heart. "America," he began, his deep voice resonating with conviction, "has always been a nation of laws, but laws mean nothing if the hearts enforcing them are blind to justice." He paused, scanning the faces before him. Politicians, journalists, citizens. "Last month, I was arrested for trespassing," he continued. "But what I truly trespassed was an invisible boundary that still divides us. One built from fear, prejudice, and misunderstanding." The chamber was silent. Even his critics were listening. "I don't seek revenge," he said. "I seek renewal. That's why today I'm introducing the Miles Initiative for Justice Reform, a program dedicated to mandatory empathy and accountability training in every police department nationwide. Because change doesn't start with laws. It starts with people willing to see each other fully." Applause thundered through the room. As he left the podium, several senators, some who had once opposed his policies, stood to shake his hand. Days later, Senator Miles returned quietly to Lakeside. No cameras, no crowds this time. He drove past the familiar country club, now under new management, its sign repainted and its membership open to all. The once exclusive gates were gone, literally dismantled. He smiled faintly. One small victory, he thought. Pulling into the police station, he was surprised to see a familiar face waiting by the door. "Senator Miles," Daniels greeted, standing tall in his crisp uniform. "Officer," David replied, offering a warm handshake. Daniels took a deep breath. "Sir, I just wanted to tell you, I joined the new training program you started. Been mentoring young recruits about bias awareness. It's changed how I see things, how I see people." David studied him for a moment, then nodded. "That's all I ever hoped for." Daniels hesitated, then asked quietly, "Do you think people can really change?" David smiled. "Change isn't an event, Daniels, it's a choice. Every day, every moment." The officer nodded, his eyes reflecting a mixture of humility and newfound purpose. As they stood there, a young boy on a bicycle stopped nearby, waving excitedly. "Hey, you're Senator Miles!" David chuckled. "That's me. My mom says you made the cops nicer," the boy said innocently. She says you fixed them. David laughed softly. No, son, they fixed themselves. I just reminded them they could. The boy grinned and pedaled away, his laughter echoing down the street. That evening, David walked along the lakeside, the same place where he had been wrongfully arrested. The water shimmered gold under the setting sun, peaceful and still. He sat on a bench, hands clasped, watching as families walked by. Black, white, brown, all laughing, unafraid. The same community that once looked away now looked forward. Mariah, his aide, approached with her tablet in hand. Senator, CNN just called. They want to do a follow-up interview about the initiative. It's spreading faster than expected. 20 states already signed on. David nodded, a small smile forming. Good. But this isn't about headlines, it's about healing, she smiled softly. You really believe it's working? He looked out at the lake, where the reflection of the American flag waved gently on the water's surface. For the first time, he said quietly, I believe we're finally learning what justice really means. Later that night, as he prepared for bed, he received one final email notification. It was from Officer Daniels. The subject line read, Thank you. David opened it and read the simple message, DHA Senator Miles. I used to think authority meant control. You taught me it means responsibility. I'll never forget that. Daniels. He closed the laptop, feeling an unspoken peace settle over him. Outside his window, the city lights flickered, bright, hopeful, alive. And though his journey had begun with humiliation and injustice, it ended with something far greater, redemption, unity, and the belief that one man's calm courage could rewrite the meaning of belonging.